If you were Satan and you wanted to devise a plan that would severely damage the effectiveness of the church, then based on what we've discovered in this series, wouldn't PMO addiction be a great way to go about it? I mean, get the church hooked on porn and enslave them to compulsive masturbation, and think of the far-reaching consequences. What if a large percentage of the church was experiencing anhedonia? What if they were experiencing less joy in the Lord because they were experiencing less joy in everything? What if they had a numbed pleasure response to everyday gifts from God? Wouldn't that make them less thankful? Wouldn't that dull the passion in their prayers and in their worship? Wouldn't they become less productive for the kingdom? Wouldn't they become demotivated to carry out their mission on earth, to evangelize, to witness, to strive for righteousness? And what if it brought about social anxiety too? Wouldn't there be less close fellowship between the believers? Wouldn't the people of God become lonelier and more isolated, perhaps then turning to quick dopamine fixes to smother their pain? And wouldn't that perhaps put them on a downward spiral? Wouldn't PMO addiction damage Christian marriages too, and frustrate the ability for husbands and wives to connect with each other? Wouldn't there be depression and hidden guilt? And what if there was stress rather than faith? I think if we were to consider the far-reaching consequences, it would become apparent that such a battle plan from the enemy could be extremely effective in crippling the body of Christ. And that's what Satan has done. Let's take a look at the very latest research statistics from Barna here. This is a lot of numbers, but basically most pastors, that's 57%, and youth pastors, 64%, admit that they do struggle or have struggled with porn addiction at some point in their lives. 21% of youth pastors and 14% of pastors admit that they currently struggle with porn addiction. About 12% of youth pastors and 5% of pastors admit that they are straight up addicted to porn right now. 87% of pastors who use porn feel a great sense of shame about it. 55% of pastors who use porn say that they live in constant fear of being discovered. The vast majority of leaders who struggle with porn say that it has significantly affected their ministry in a negative manner. Now, Barna suggests that the real percentages here are actually likely to be far higher, since many pastors and youth pastors are likely to be afraid to give open answers on this topic. For example, the same study revealed that 41% of Christians believe that a pastor should lose his job if he is found to be using porn. Now, it's possible that pastors, being aware of this fact, are keeping the true extent of their addiction hidden. Next, these are some figures for the general American population, and study after study unfortunately shows that Christians actually don't vary too widely from the wider culture in all of these following respects. Firstly, the internet has changed the game. We already talked about this earlier. 71% of adults and 85% of teens who now use pornography do so online. Magazines and DVDs now make up a very small percentage of the overall porn market. Over half of women under 25, that is 56%, actively seek out porn, and 33% of them do it at least once a month. 27% of women over 25 actively seek out porn, and 12% do it at least once a month. Now, as far as the men go, 81% of men under 25 actively seek out porn, and 67% do it at least once a month. 65% of men over 25 actively seek out porn, and 47% do it at least once a month. 71% of young adults say that they come across porn on the internet at least once a month, whether they are actively looking for it or not. Now, these numbers seemed incredibly high to me, so I wasn't ready to believe that Christians could be this enslaved. So I went looking for other studies that would give further insight into the subject. According to a study by Promise Keepers, 54% of pastors admitted to viewing porn within the past year. Another study by Blazing Grace, using a congregation of a single church in America, returned the result that 25% of men had looked at porn in the previous month, 44% had looked at porn within the previous 6 months, and 61% had looked at porn within the previous year. The most optimistic figure that I've been able to find was from Pure Life Ministries, who suggest that 33% to 50% of Christians may be regularly viewing porn. So taking all these figures together, it seems that roughly the very best that we can hope for, the very best, is that 1/3 to 1/2 of the church are currently enslaved to PMO addiction. When you're in church, if you look to your left and to your right, statistically, one of those people are currently struggling with a porn addiction. In reality, it could be far more than that. This is clearly a major problem for the church. Indeed, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission responded to the Barna study saying, finding a church member who has not been directly affected by pornography is like finding a unicorn. Josh McDowell, who commissioned the Barna study, said afterwards, I would personally say from all my knowledge now that pornography is probably the greatest threat to the cause of Christ in the history of the world. Now that's a huge statement to make, but whether we agree or not, I think we can all see where he's coming from. The invention of the internet has created the environment for a subtle, pernicious evil to creep into the church. Very silently. It's hidden in the shadows. Nobody's talking about this. And it's having a corroding effect on the body of Christ, bringing in anhedonia, loss of joy, stress, affecting worship, prayer, fellowship, marriages, bringing in depression and guilt. Something's happening here underneath the surface in church and damaging it very perniciously from within. You know, when I first considered doing this series, so I'd had a lot of emails about this topic asking me to do something on this topic. And when I first considered it, I thought, is it really big enough to actually devote all that time to? Because these series take a long time to make. There's the research, there's the writing of the books, the technical side, the design, the website, and then the recording of the actual videos. So each series basically means a commitment of at least 6 months to about a year. And I wondered, do I really want to spend up to a year of my life thinking about and talking about this issue? And is it really big enough to actually demand all that time? I think it probably seemed like a little bit of overkill at first. But then I got to this part and I realized just how big an issue this is, just how important an issue this is. This is not just a minor curiosity. The pastors that I have seen talking about this issue tend to do it in a 5 minutes kind of semi-joking kind of, well, let's just get this thing out of the way kind of attitude. And I totally get that. But something's happening here which is much more than that. There's something much more dangerous happening here. And also any pastor who says, oh yeah, but pornography has just always been there, that's always been an issue, that's as old as the hills. They haven't quite grasped the scale of what's happening, what has happened in the past 15 to 20 years because of the internet. The availability of porn and the depravity of what's available now is just on this whole other level. And also remember, possibly around half of the church are now struggling with this enslavement. And that's why I've been so keen to emphasize exactly what anhedonia can do. I've kept bringing up the screen to emphasize this is how much PMO addiction can really affect our minds, our emotions, and our lives. It can really bring destruction. It can damage the body of Christ. And the embarrassment factor, the taboo factor, means that many Christians, so many Christians, are suffering silently within its grasp. To be fair, there is at least a broad acknowledgement that the problem is growing. In the Barna study, 93% of pastors and 94% of youth pastors said that pornography is a much bigger problem now than in the past. However, most churches have still not really reacted to it. There are still very few places where people can come forward for help, very few programs in place to counteract this epidemic. There also seems to be a culture of fear. Christians believe that if they did admit they have a problem with this, the church wouldn't help, but would rather admonish and exclude. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission say churches must prepare for the depth of sexual brokenness ahead. Jesus' mercy must be freshly displayed through the preaching of the word, compassionate ministry of God's worth, through biblical counseling, and patient love that will help people ravished by sin receive the help and hope they need. Having understood the ways in which anhedonia wreaks havoc on our lives and having explored the ways in which the porn industry exploits and enslaves, I think it's time that we came up with a plan for this problem. The enemy's just doing too much damage in this area right now and we just have to react somehow. We need a game plan for this. If the Fuel Project can implement anything or be part of a movement that's already helping in this area, then I would gladly make it a part of this ministry. So do feel free to come forward if you're already a part of something like that. But I think it's probably more likely that the real healing will need to be done locally, through the local church. We need to create atmospheres in church where people feel free to come forward and to be honest about stuff like this, and then where the damage can then be healed, dealt with, and undone.